47th Street in New York City is one of the most bustling streets in the world. And blocks away from the Chrysler Building and Grand Central Station, on a cold afternoon in early 1966, a silver painting of Elvis Presley by Andy Warhol was being crammed into a station wagon by none other than folk legend Bob Dylan and his entourage. Or at least, trying to be crammed into a station wagon. Would it fit in the trunk? Definitely not. After much hemming and hawing, with members of Warhol's factory peering out the window to see how exactly Dylan would manage this feat, the Elvis painting was finally strapped to the roof of the car before it was driven upstate to Hailoha, Dylan's house up in Woodstock. If the painting was treated poorly on its journey from factory to upstate retreat, it wasn't exactly given pride of place upon its arrival either. According to legend, and this is a story filled with legends, it was hung upside down, stashed in a cupboard, used as a dartboard, and cut into so that a hose could be fed through Elvis's groin to make it look like he was urinating. What we do know for sure is that eventually, Dylan traded it for nothing more than a sofa. The story of Bob Dylan, Andy Warhol, and the Double Elvis is a story about the manufacturing of myths, about power and fame, and perhaps most importantly, about what we value and what happens to the things we throw away. It is both a simple story and a complicated one, where nothing is really as it seems. I'm Emma Laramie, and this is Verso. "1963, 3 years before the fateful encounter with Bob Dylan, was Andy Warhol's silver year. He had just moved into what would become known as the First Factory, a former hat-making factory on 47th Street. The name, like the atmosphere, happened organically and took on a life of its own. Billy Name, one of the main figures around the factory, covered the entire thing in a silver aluminum foil. 1963 was also the year Warhol swapped out his gray hair piece for a silver metallic one. And it was the year of the Silver Elvises, a series in which Warhol took a single publicity photo of the star, gun drawn, and printed it over and over again against a wash of metallic silver, sometimes doubled, sometimes tripled, sometimes ghosting into a blur. Set against all of that silver, stripped of any background or story, Elvis stopped looking like a man and started looking like a strip of film. Pure image, pure surface. Henry Geldzahler, then a curator of modern art at the Met, called the factory a, quote, glamorous clubhouse with everyone trying to get Andy's attention. It was like Louis XV getting up in the morning. The big question was whom Andy would notice, end quote. But the look of the place belied the Versailles-esque attitude the factory crowd had about Warhol. Aside from the silver foil walls, the space was spare. A stuffed couch, a couple of other pieces of furniture procured from the Salvation Army, and a Coinwell telephone that was in constant use. For as much as he may have been the Louis XV of the factory, Warhol always came off as shy, aloof, and naive. And he was all of those things, but he was also the world's best voyeur. He saw everything, noticed everything. Driven, perhaps above all else, by celebrity, Warhol wanted to surround himself with people who he felt could do something for him. And he would put up with just about anything if you fulfilled that purpose for him. Yet, for as much as Warhol wanted to surround himself with, and to be a celebrity, he was known for hiding behind a kind of impenetrable mask. He exhibited a clear disdain for the press, and would often play dumb for them, telling them his works meant nothing when actually they were loaded with meaning, changing stories up on them constantly. It's one of the brilliant elements of Warhol, but it's also the thing that makes telling his stories difficult. You never really know what is truth and what is myth. Bob Dylan shared this instinct with Warhol, although they appear to us now as wildly different people. Geldzahler also noted this link between the two, observing how the 60s generation of rock stars were the only ones who carried through Warhol's quote-unquote monumental impenetrability. Like Warhol, Dylan took joy in making a journalist squirm, and the various stories he has told about himself and his career will probably never be fully clear as to which is fact and which is fiction. But if both had disdain for the press, the legend has built itself such that they both had disdain for each other. If you were anyone in 1960s New York, it seemed like you had two choices, Bob Dylan or Andy Warhol. And although we'll never truly know how one felt about the other, there certainly must have been some truth to their mutual dislike. Perhaps both saw the other too clearly, and it spooked them both. But the one woman who was able to bridge the gap between them was Edie Sedgwick. Referred to as the first lady of the factory and Andy's prime companion, she was the kind of person who drew everybody's attention. Andy had a great ability to see who had an essential flame and bring it out of them, and he did that with Edie in spades. Bob Dylan saw that flame too, only heightening their rivalry, culminating in Dylan procuring the Elvis painting. As it's come to be known today, the story goes that Sedgwick was the pawn in the fight between these two titans of culture, with Dylan trying successfully to lure her away from the factory. This has come to be taken as Dylan and Sedgwick having a romantic relationship, despite his recent and secret marriage to Sarah. It's another one of those elements of the story that we'll never really get to the bottom of, but either way, a lot was at stake in their relationship to each other. By the time Dylan came to the factory in early 1966 to do his screen test, this back and forth between them had been going on for the better part of a year. According to Gerard Malanga, one of Andy's main right-hand men, Dylan and Warhol, quote, kind of danced around each other in a funny way, a solicitous kind of dance. Who was going to get what out of whom, end quote. Dylan was the winner, at least in the short term. As one version of the legend we have today tells it, Dylan more or less demanded a painting as payment for his time doing the screen test. Warhol was usually a pretty generous guy, often giving paintings away, but when he did so, it was usually to people he was actually friends with, and it was more like a 4x4-inch flower painting, not a 6-foot-tall silver Elvis. But that was the one Dylan wanted, so that was the one he got. Some say Warhol gave it to him enthusiastically, but again, we'll never really know. But the painting was almost a sideshow to Dylan. The real prize in the contest was Edie. By 1965, she and Warhol had become inseparable, photographed everywhere as a matched set. And then, the story goes, Dylan began to pull her away. Paul Morrissey, who ran much of the factory's film operation, told the most detailed version of it. As he remembered it, Dylan and his manager Albert Grossman started turning up around the factory, supposedly to hear the Velvet Underground's new singer Nico rehearse, but what they really wanted was Edie. Dylan would call her and invite her out, telling her not to breathe a word to Warhol. He invited her up to Woodstock. He told her Grossman wanted to make her a star, that she could be his leading lady in a movie. Grossman, for his part, began suggesting she not spend so much time at the factory. The publicity, he said, wasn't doing her any favors. And slowly, in Morrissey's telling, it worked. Suddenly it was Bobby this and Bobby that, and the factory realized she had fallen for him. One of the final breaking points came on the set of a film called Lupe in December of 1965, the last movie Edie would make with Warhol. One of Dylan's friends turned up with sugar cubes laced with acid, and to the factory, that felt like an ambush, a deliberate sabotage of their work, and the final sign that Edie had crossed over to the other side. And then there's the cruelest beat in the whole story. One afternoon, Warhol learned from his lawyer that Dylan had quietly married Sarah months earlier. He couldn't resist. He turned to Edie and asked, almost sweetly, whether she knew that Bob Dylan had gotten married. She went pale. She started to tremble. Because she, it turned out, had believed all of it. Then, as the final nail in the coffin, Dylan shows up, does a screen test, and walks away with one of Warhol's best paintings to date, tied to the roof of his station wagon. That is the story as it has come down to us, and it's a good one. It has a villain, a victim, and a prize, and it runs a clean, straight line from rivalry to seduction to betrayal. The only problem is that almost none of it really holds up. Starting with the timeline. For the legend to work, Edie has to be Warhol's girl first and Dylan's girl second, handed from one man to another like a trophy moving to a new shelf. But Dylan and Sedgwick first met at the tail end of 1964, which happens to be the very same moment that Edie and Andy found one another. So there was no clean before and after. They all arrived in one another's lives at once, and they stayed tangled up the whole way through. The two camps don't seem to be as separate as the story needs them to be either. On October 1st, 1965, right in the thick of the supposed war, the factory put out a glowing press release about Edie, and a few days later, she and Warhol turned up together as a pair at a party thrown for Bob Dylan. And even after she drifted towards Dylan's world, there was never a clean break. She kept coming back to the factory and to Velvet Underground shows, and she was welcomed every time, until the whole thing simply faded out rather than ending in any single dramatic scene. Then there's Dylan himself, who has spent decades shrugging the entire thing off. Quote, "I never had that much to do with Edie Sedgwick. I don't recall any type of relationship. If I did have one, I think I'd remember," end quote. His friend Bob Neuwirth remembered a gentler, fuzzier version. Someone telling Dylan he had to meet this terrific girl, Edie chartering a limousine to come find them, an hour or two of laughing in a bar on McDougal Street with snow outside, a walk to look at a church display of Christmas lights. Whatever actually happened between them, Edie comes down to us blurred, spoken for by other people, which is an unfortunate fate for the one person in that room nobody could stop looking at. And the rivalry, the great Dylan versus Warhol feud at the center of everything, it may be largely something we built after the fact. It wasn't even Edie who brought Dylan into the factory that day to do the screen test. It was an experimental filmmaker named Barbara Rubin, who is seen massaging Dylan's head on the back cover of Bringing It All Back Home. The photographs taken the day of the screen test also don't necessarily show two enemies. They show Dylan and Warhol standing side by side in what looks like easy admiration, considering the Elvises together. And as late as that autumn, Warhol was still telling reporters that he and Dylan were going to open a nightclub together. So, which is it? Were they rivals circling each other, or two artists who liked each other more than the myth allows? Did Dylan demand the painting, or did Andy, the eternal celebrity-obsessed fan, simply press it on the most famous man he'd had in the factory up to that point? The honest answer is that we'll never know. And that isn't a flaw in the story, it's kind of the point of it. These were two men who spent their entire lives making certain that no one could ever pin down what they meant, or what they felt, or what they wanted. With Warhol and Dylan, the fog isn't in front of the picture. The fog is the picture. And they both became these mythological figures as a result, with people searching in vain for the truth of who they were. For both of them, it was their secret power. Which leaves us with the one thing in this story that can't dodge a question or change its story to suit the room, and is perhaps the most absurd part of the whole thing: the painting itself. Although the people who were there spoke of Dylan's desire to own the silkscreen, what happened to that painting tells a completely different story. As mentioned at the top, once Dylan finally got the painting off the hood of his car and into his Woodstock home, rumors quickly began swirling that he couldn't have cared less about it. Whether any of it was actually true, the hanging it upside down, the shutting it away in a cupboard, what we do know for certain is that eventually Dylan showed the painting to his manager, Albert Grossman, and his wife, Sally, saying, quote, "I don't want this. Why did he give it to me?" End quote. And explaining that his wife, Sarah, wanted something practical for the house. So they cut a deal. The Grossmans would give them a sofa, and they would get the Elvis in exchange. Warhol, however, cared about the painting deeply. So much so that even 12 years later, he was still trying to understand what had happened to it. In May of 1978, Warhol was having lunch with Martin Scorsese and Robbie Robertson of the band, who finally told him what had happened, excusing it by saying that it was in Dylan's quote-unquote drug days. The tale was confirmed just a few weeks later at a party in London hosted for Dylan himself. Their host, Nona Gordon Summers, tells Dylan that he should buy a Warhol, and he admits in front of Warhol that he already had one and traded it. It's important to note that this kind of thing was unusual for Warhol to do. He didn't chase after his paintings. So the fact that this one stayed in his mind for more than a decade means that however willing or excited he may have been to give the painting to Dylan in the moment, he had come to regret it. And pretty quickly after the whole trade went down, the Elvises became, and remain, one of Warhol's most enduring works. And there's a special sort of irony in that. Warhol chose a publicity photo of Elvis from his 1960 movie Flaming Star, taken when Elvis had just come back from 2 years in the army and done a string of formulaic Hollywood movies, and his celebrity was on the downswing. He managed to take this low moment and turn it into something more enduring than the movie itself. Dylan may have admired it as one musician looking at another, but ultimately, he wanted something practical. And Warhol, the celebrity-obsessed, aloof, shy one, knew better than all of them. But the joke was ultimately on Dylan. Whatever the couch had actually looked like, there's no way it had the kind of lasting value that the Double Elvis and the series more generally would come to hold. In 1988, just 2 years after her husband died, and 1 year after Warhol died, Sally Grossman sold the Double Elvis at Christie's for $880,000 with fees. The painting eventually came into the hands of a prominent collecting couple named Emily and Jerry Spiegel, and in 2001, they gifted it to the Museum of Modern Art. It's the only Warhol Elvis the museum has. And if you thought $880,000 was a lot, know that in May of 2026, a very similar-looking Double Elvis to the one at the heart of this story sold for $27,085,000, also at Christie's. I bet Dylan meant it when he said that if he could do it all over again, he never would have given the painting away. This episode was written, narrated, and produced by me, Emma Laramie. If you enjoyed this story, if something here surprised you, made you think differently, or just gave you something interesting to talk about over drinks with friends, do me a favor. Follow the show. Leave a rating or a review if you're feeling generous. And if there's an artist or a moment in art history you're curious about, drop a comment below. Thanks for listening. I'll see you next time.